Marcus Williams had always been different from his peers. At 22, he possessed an unusual combination of book smarts and street awareness that made him stand out in ways that often invited ridicule rather than respect. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, he had been the kid who preferred reading military strategy books to playing video games, who studied martial arts techniques from library books rather than joining the school football team. When Marcus announced his intention to join the military, his high school classmates had laughed. They remembered him as the quiet, skinny kid who got picked last for every team sport and who spent lunch breaks alone, sketching tactical formations in his notebook margins. His decision seemed like a desperate attempt to prove himself, and many predicted he would wash out within weeks of basic training. The local recruitment office was bustling the day Marcus walked in. Sergeant Rodriguez, a weathered veteran with 15 years of service, looked up from his paperwork as the young man approached his desk. Marcus was tall but lean, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of pale complexion that suggested more time spent indoors than out. "I want to enlist," Marcus said simply, his voice steady despite the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from him. Sergeant Rodriguez had seen thousands of recruits over the years. He could usually spot the ones who would struggle within the first few minutes of conversation. This young man had all the physical markers of someone who might find military life challenging. But there was something in his demeanor that gave the sergeant pause. "What's your background, son?" Rodriguez asked, pulling out the initial paperwork. Marcus explained his educational history, his lack of sports experience, and his genuine desire to serve his country. He spoke about his fascination with military history and strategy, his self-taught knowledge of various combat techniques, and his belief that he could contribute something valuable to the armed forces. The sergeant listened carefully, noting both the young man's enthusiasm and his apparent naivety about what military service actually entailed. After completing the initial interview and scheduling Marcus for the required tests and physical examinations, Rodriguez found himself curious about how this particular recruit would fare. 3 weeks later, Marcus arrived at Fort Benning for basic training. The bus ride had been long and uncomfortable, filled with young men and women from all walks of life, each carrying their own hopes and fears about the journey ahead. As they disembarked and formed their first formation, Marcus could already sense the hierarchies beginning to form among his fellow recruits. There was Jake Thompson, a former high school football star from Texas who immediately took on a leadership role among the group. Sarah Chun, who had grown up on a farm and possessed the kind of practical toughness that came from years of physical labor. Miguel Santos, who had served in the National Guard and already understood military protocol better than most. And then there was Marcus, standing slightly apart from the others, his military-issue glasses already fogging up in the humid Georgia air, his uniform hanging a bit loose on his still-developing frame. Drill Sergeant Patterson was everything Marcus had expected and more. A mountain of muscle and authority, with a voice that could cut through steel and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. As he walked down the line of new recruits, his gaze lingered on each face, sizing up the raw material he had to work with. When he reached Marcus, Patterson stopped. He looked the young recruit up and down, taking in the nervous energy, the intellectual curiosity barely contained behind those glasses, and the determined set of shoulders that suggested this one might be more than he appeared. "What's your name, recruit?" Patterson barked. "Marcus Williams, Drill Sergeant." "Where you from, Williams?" "Ohio, Drill Sergeant." Patterson continued his inspection, but Marcus could feel the man's attention returning to him throughout that first day. It wasn't necessarily hostile attention, but it was definitely focused, as if the drill sergeant was trying to solve a puzzle. The first week of basic training was brutal for Marcus. The physical demands were exactly what he had expected, but experiencing them was entirely different from reading about them. The early morning runs left him gasping and struggling to keep up with the pack. The obstacle courses challenged every muscle in his body, many of which he didn't even know he possessed. The endless push-ups, sit-ups, and calisthenics pushed him to limits he had never imagined. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that tested him. The social dynamics among the recruits created their own set of obstacles. Jake Thompson had quickly established himself as the unofficial leader of their platoon. and he seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out Marcus's struggles. "Look at Professor over there," Jake would say during breaks, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Bet he wishes he was back in his library right about now." The laughter that followed these comments stung more than Marcus had expected. He had known he would face physical challenges, but he hadn't fully prepared himself for the social isolation that came with being perceived as weak or different. Sarah Chun, despite her own toughness, occasionally showed Marcus small kindnesses. She would offer tips on how to properly clean his rifle or share techniques for making his bunk pass inspection. But even her help came with a certain pity that made Marcus feel worse rather than better. Miguel Santos was more direct in his assessment. "You're gonna wash out, man," he told Marcus one evening as they cleaned their equipment. "This isn't for everyone, and there's no shame in admitting it's not for you." But Marcus had no intention of washing out. Every evening, after the official training day ended and the other recruits collapsed into their bunks, he would sneak out to practice. Under the cover of darkness, he would run the obstacle courses again, working on his technique and building his endurance. He studied the training manuals by flashlight, memorizing every protocol and procedure until he could recite them perfectly. His academic background, while initially seeming like a disadvantage in the physical environment of basic training, began to serve him in unexpected ways. When they started learning about military tactics and strategy, Marcus's years of independent study gave him a foundation that his peers lacked. He could visualize complex battlefield scenarios and understand the reasoning behind various tactical decisions in ways that impressed even the instructors. Drill Sergeant Patterson began to notice these strengths, though he kept his observations to himself. He had learned over the years that some recruits who struggled initially with the physical aspects of training could develop into exceptional soldiers if given the chance to find their footing. The turning point came during their third week of training. The platoon was working on hand-to-hand combat techniques, something that Marcus had studied extensively in theory but had never practiced with a live opponent. The instructor paired recruits up for sparring sessions, and Marcus found himself facing off against Jake Thompson. Jake was bigger, stronger, and more athletic than Marcus in every measurable way. The match seemed so lopsided that several other recruits gathered around to watch what they expected to be a quick and decisive victory for the former football star. "Try not to break Professor too badly," someone called out, generating another round of laughter. Marcus took his stance, remembering countless hours spent studying various martial arts techniques. He had always been better at analyzing and understanding movement patterns than actually executing them. But something felt different this time. The weeks of intense physical training had changed his body in ways he was only beginning to understand. Jake came forward aggressively, confident in his physical superiority. But Marcus had spent years studying the principles of leverage, timing, and technique. When Jake overextended himself with a powerful but poorly controlled punch, Marcus slipped to the side and used the bigger man's momentum against him. The throw that followed was textbook perfect, a combination of timing, technique, and leverage that sent Jake sprawling to the ground in a way that looked almost effortless. The laughter from the watching recruits died immediately, replaced by shocked silence. Jake got up quickly, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He came at Marcus again, more carefully this time, but the result was similar. Marcus seemed to anticipate every move, using superior technique to compensate for his physical disadvantages. By the time the instructor called an end to the session, Marcus had demonstrated a level of skill that none of his peers had expected. The respect in their eyes was mixed with confusion and perhaps a touch of fear. Drill Sergeant Patterson watched the entire exchange without comment, but Marcus could see something had changed in the man's expression. The patronizing attention had been replaced by genuine professional interest. That evening, as the platoon prepared for lights out, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The casual mockery that had been Marcus's constant companion had largely disappeared, replaced by a cautious respect. Some of the other recruits even asked him questions about the techniques he had used, genuinely curious about his knowledge. Jake Thompson, to his credit, approached Marcus directly. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked, without any of his usual condescension. "Books, mostly," Marcus replied honestly, "and a lot of practice by myself." Jake shook his head in amazement. I never would have guessed. You had me completely fooled. Over the following days, Marcus began to find his place within the group dynamic. His academic knowledge became a resource that others sought out, while his growing physical capabilities earned him the respect he had been lacking. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was undeniable. Drill Sergeant Patterson began giving Marcus additional responsibilities, testing his leadership potential in small ways. When the platoon struggled with map reading exercises, Marcus became their unofficial instructor. When they had trouble understanding tactical concepts, he could explain them in ways that made sense to his peers. But, perhaps most importantly, Marcus's confidence began to grow. The physical challenges that had seemed insurmountable during his first week were becoming manageable. His body was adapting to the demands of military training, while his mind found ways to excel in areas that played to his strengths. The other recruits began to see him differently too. Instead of the weak link they had initially perceived, they started to recognize someone who brought unique value to their unit. His analytical skills, combined with his growing physical capabilities, made him an asset in training exercises. As they entered the fourth week of basic training, Marcus realized that he had crossed an invisible threshold. He was no longer fighting just to survive each day, but actually beginning to thrive in the military environment. The foundation was being laid for what would become a remarkable military career, though none of them could have predicted just how extraordinary that career would become. 6 months after graduating from basic training, Marcus Williams found himself assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the most elite units in the United States Army. His transformation during basic training had been remarkable, but it was his performance in advanced individual training and the subsequent selection processes that had truly caught the attention of his superiors. The Rangers were different from anything Marcus had experienced before. These were soldiers who had already proven themselves in regular units and had volunteered for the additional challenges that came with special operations. The physical standards were higher, the training more intense, and the expectations exponentially greater. Staff Sergeant David Brooks, Marcus's new team leader, was a veteran of multiple combat deployments with a reputation for being both demanding and fair. When Marcus reported to his new unit, Brooks looked over his file with interest. Says here you went from being a marginal physical performer to graduating second in your class from Ranger School, Brooks noted, looking up at Marcus with appraising eyes. That's quite a turnaround. Yes, Staff Sergeant, Marcus replied, standing at attention. The question is whether that improvement was just about adapting to military life, or if you've got the potential to keep growing, Brooks continued. Rangers don't just meet standards, Williams. We exceed them consistently, under pressure, when lives depend on it. Marcus understood the challenge being laid before him. In his new unit, his previous achievements were just the entry fee. Now he would have to prove himself all over again, this time among soldiers who were already proven performers. His new teammates were initially skeptical, but professionally courteous. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the unit's communications specialist, had been with the Rangers for 4 years and had developed a sixth sense for identifying soldiers who wouldn't last. Corporal James Mitchell, a demolitions expert, had seen too many promising soldiers wash out under pressure to get excited about any newcomer. The training schedule was relentless. Physical fitness sessions that would have been considered extreme in regular units were just warm-ups for the Rangers. Combat scenarios were conducted with live ammunition and real consequences for mistakes. The margin for error was essentially zero. Marcus threw himself into the training with the same analytical approach that had served him well before, but now he had the physical foundation to support his intellectual understanding. He studied not just the techniques they were learning, but the reasoning behind them, the historical context in which they had been developed, and the ways they might be adapted for different situations. His approach began to pay dividends in unexpected ways. During urban warfare training exercises, while other soldiers focused on executing the specific scenarios they had practiced, Marcus demonstrated an ability to adapt standard techniques to novel situations. When faced with a building layout that didn't match any of their training scenarios, he could rapidly analyze the tactical challenges and develop effective solutions. Staff Sergeant Brooks began to take notice. During a particularly challenging night exercise, when the unit was tasked with clearing a series of connected buildings under time pressure, Marcus suggested a tactical modification that reduced their exposure time by nearly half while maintaining security protocols. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that separated good soldiers from exceptional ones. But it was during a routine training exercise that Marcus's true capabilities would first be fully displayed. The Rangers were conducting a joint training exercise with Navy SEALs, practicing coordination between different special operations units. The scenario involved rescuing hostages from a mock terrorist compound, with both teams playing different roles in the operation. The exercise had been designed to test communication, coordination, and adaptability under pressure. What no one had planned for was the aggressive competitiveness that developed between the two elite units. What should have been a cooperative training exercise gradually took on the atmosphere of a competition, with each team trying to outperform the other. The SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, was a seasoned operator with a reputation for tactical brilliance. He had designed what he considered an impossible scenario for the Rangers to solve, expecting them to request assistance or acknowledge that the mission parameters were unrealistic. The setup involved hostages held in a fortified compound with multiple layers of security, limited approach routes, and a tight time constraint that seemed to make a successful rescue impossible using conventional tactics. Harrison had run the numbers multiple times and was confident that any frontal assault would result in unacceptable casualties to both the rescue team and the hostages. Marcus studied the briefing materials with his characteristic intensity, but this time something was different. Instead of simply analyzing the tactical challenges, he began to see patterns and possibilities that weren't immediately obvious. His years of studying military history had given him exposure to unconventional approaches that most modern soldiers never considered. Staff Sergeant, Marcus said quietly to Brooks during the planning phase, "What if we're thinking about this wrong?" Brooks looked up from the tactical maps spread across their planning table. "What do you mean, Williams?" "Everyone's focused on the fortifications and the security measures," Marcus explained. "But what if those aren't really the primary obstacles? What if we're dealing with a fundamentally different type of problem?" Marcus began sketching out an alternative approach, one that focused not on overwhelming the compound's defenses, but on making them irrelevant. His plan involved a combination of misdirection, timing, and psychological pressure that would force the defenders to react in predictable ways, creating opportunities that wouldn't exist under normal circumstances. The plan was unconventional enough that Brooks initially dismissed it as too risky. But as Marcus walked through each phase, explaining the reasoning behind every element, the staff sergeant began to see the elegance of the approach. It wasn't just creative, it was strategically sound in ways that traditional tactics couldn't match. "This is either brilliant or completely insane," Brooks muttered, studying Marcus's diagrams. "Maybe both, Staff Sergeant," Marcus replied with a slight smile. Brooks made the decision to present Marcus's plan to the team. The reaction was mixed, with some soldiers expressing skepticism about deviating so far from established protocols. But Sergeant Rodriguez, who had initially been doubtful about Marcus's capabilities, found herself intrigued by the tactical possibilities. "It's definitely not what they're expecting," she observed. "And if it works, it would completely change how we approach this type of scenario." The team spent the next several hours refining Marcus's basic concept, working out timing issues and communication protocols. By the time they were ready to execute, they had developed something entirely new, a tactical approach that none of them had ever attempted before. The exercise began at dawn, with both teams moving into their initial positions. The SEAL observers, confident in their scenario design, settled in to watch what they expected would be a lengthy and ultimately unsuccessful assault on the compound. Marcus's plan began with what appeared to be a standard reconnaissance phase, with Rangers moving to observe the compound from multiple angles. But instead of simply gathering intelligence, they were positioning themselves for a coordinated psychological operation designed to manipulate the defenders' expectations and responses. The first phase involved creating the illusion of a much larger force than was actually present. Using smoke, noise, and carefully timed movements, the Rangers made it appear that they were preparing for a massive frontal assault from the eastern approach to the compound. Meanwhile, Marcus and two other Rangers had infiltrated to within 50 meters of the western wall, using a drainage system that had been dismissed by the scenario designers as too small for tactical use. Marcus's smaller frame and detailed study of the compound plans had revealed an approach route that larger soldiers couldn't have used effectively. As the diversionary activity intensified on the eastern side, the compound's defenders did exactly what Marcus had predicted. They reinforced their eastern defenses, pulling guards from other positions to meet what appeared to be the primary threat. The timing of the next phase was critical. As the defenders focused their attention eastward, Marcus and his team used breaching charges to create entry points in the western wall. But instead of immediately entering, they used the openings to deploy smoke and flashbang grenades that created maximum confusion within the compound. In the chaos that followed, the defenders lost track of the Rangers' actual positions and numbers. The psychological pressure of dealing with threats from multiple directions, combined with the sensory disruption from the smoke and explosions, created exactly the kind of decision-making environment that Marcus had designed to exploit. The hostage rescue itself took less than 40 seconds from the moment the first Ranger entered the compound to the moment the last hostage was evacuated to safety. The defenders, still trying to respond to threats that no longer existed, were unable to mount any effective resistance. Lieutenant Commander Harrison watched the entire operation with a mixture of amazement and professional respect. In 15 years of special operations experience, he had never seen such a creative tactical approach executed so flawlessly. The Rangers had solved his impossible scenario in a way that made it look almost easy. "Where the hell did that come from?" he asked Brooks as the exercise concluded. "Williams," Brooks replied simply, nodding toward Marcus, who was helping with the post-exercise equipment recovery. Harrison studied Marcus with new interest. The young Ranger didn't look like the tactical genius who had just revolutionized the exercise scenario. He still had the intellectual appearance that had made him seem out of place among elite soldiers. But there was a confidence and competence in his movements that spoke to fundamental changes in his capabilities. The debriefing session that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. Instead of the usual routine analysis of what had gone right or wrong, the discussion focused on the innovative tactical concepts his plan had introduced. Both the Rangers and SEALs wanted to understand the thinking behind the approach, recognizing its potential applications for real-world operations. Marcus found himself explaining not just what they had done, but why each element had been necessary and how similar principles might be applied to other scenarios. His ability to articulate complex tactical concepts in clear, understandable terms impressed even the most senior operators present. The key insight, Marcus explained to the group, was recognizing that this wasn't really a fortress assault problem. It was a human behavior management problem. Once you understand how people react under stress, you can design situations where their natural responses work in your favor instead of against you. Staff Sergeant Brooks realized that he was witnessing something special. Marcus hadn't just executed a successful mission, he had demonstrated a level of tactical thinking that could change how their unit approached complex problems. The young soldier who had once struggled to complete basic training exercises was now teaching lessons to some of the most experienced special operations personnel in the military. The exercise results were forwarded up the chain of command, eventually reaching officers who specialized in identifying and developing exceptional tactical talent. Marcus Williams had just announced himself as someone worth watching, though he wouldn't fully understand the implications of that attention until much later. 2 years after the joint exercise that had first showcased his tactical innovations, Marcus Williams found himself in a position he had never imagined possible. At 25, he held the rank of Staff Sergeant and had been selected for assignment to a classified special operations unit that operated under the direct authority of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The unit, known only by its designation Delta 7, handled the most sensitive and complex operations that regular special forces couldn't manage. Marcus's reputation for tactical innovation had spread throughout the special operations community, earning him a place among soldiers whose names would never appear in public records but whose actions shaped the course of international events. His new commanding officer, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, was a legendary figure in special operations circles. She had commanded successful operations on every continent and had personally recruited each member of her team based on their unique capabilities and proven performance under extreme pressure. "Sergeant Williams," she said during his initial briefing, "your file makes for interesting reading. From struggling recruit to tactical innovator in less than 3 years. That kind of transformation suggests either exceptional adaptability or exceptional deception. I'm betting on the former." Marcus stood at attention, still sometimes amazed by how far he had come from the uncertain young man who had first walked into the recruitment office. "Thank you, Colonel." "Don't thank me yet," Mitchell replied with a slight smile. "We have a situation that requires exactly the kind of unconventional thinking you've demonstrated. But this time, the stakes are considerably higher than training exercises." The briefing that followed introduced Marcus to the most complex operational challenge he had ever encountered. A terrorist organization had seized control of a research facility in Eastern Europe, taking hostage a team of international scientists working on classified defense projects. The facility was located in a mountainous region with limited access routes, and the terrorists had demonstrated both sophisticated tactical knowledge and access to advanced weaponry. Multiple rescue attempts by local forces had failed, resulting in casualties and increasing the terrorists' paranoia and security measures. The situation had reached a stalemate, with the hostage-takers threatening to execute their prisoners if any further rescue attempts were made. "Every conventional approach has been tried," Colonel Mitchell explained. "Frontal assault, infiltration, negotiation, siege tactics. The terrorists have proven capable of countering standard special operations procedures. We need something completely different." Marcus studied the intelligence reports and facility schematics with his characteristic thoroughness, but this time the analytical challenge was unlike anything he had faced before. The terrorists weren't just well-trained. They were specifically prepared for the kinds of tactics that special operations units typically employed. Their leader, identified as Viktor Kozlov, was a former Spetsnaz operative with extensive experience in both conventional and unconventional warfare. He had designed the facility's defenses specifically to counter special operations tactics, creating multiple overlapping security zones that would make any traditional rescue attempt extremely costly in terms of both time and casualties. "They've studied us as much as we've studied them," Marcus observed to his new team members during their first planning session. "Every standard approach plays into their strengths." The team itself was unlike any military unit Marcus had previously served with. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez was a communications specialist with a PhD in computer science who could hack virtually any electronic system. Captain David Park had spent 5 years working undercover in international criminal organizations before returning to military service. Lieutenant Sarah Thompson was a former CIA operative with expertise in psychological operations and behavioral analysis. "So what's your assessment, Williams?" asked Captain Park. "Are we looking at an impossible mission?" Marcus spent several more hours studying the intelligence before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a confidence that surprised even him. "Not impossible," he said. "But we're going to have to think about this in a completely different way. We can't beat them at their own game, so we need to change the game entirely." Over the next 48 hours, Marcus developed what would later be described as one of the most audacious rescue plans in military history. Instead of trying to overcome the facility's defenses, his plan was designed to make those defenses irrelevant by fundamentally altering the operational context. The key insight came from his study of the terrorist psychology and motivation. Unlike typical hostage situations, where the captors were primarily interested in political concessions or ransom payments, this group seemed motivated by a desire to demonstrate their tactical superiority over Western special forces. They wanted to prove that they could defeat any rescue attempt, and they had prepared extensively for that confrontation. "What if we don't give them the confrontation they're expecting?" Marcus asked during a late-night planning session. "What if we create a situation where their preparations become liabilities instead of assets?" His plan centered around a concept he called tactical misdirection, which involved creating multiple false scenarios that would force the terrorists to disperse their resources and attention. Instead of one rescue attempt that they could focus all their defenses against, Marcus proposed a series of coordinated operations that would overwhelm their ability to respond effectively. The first phase involved Master Sergeant Vasquez using her cyber warfare skills to gradually compromise the facility's electronic systems. Instead of a dramatic system shutdown that would immediately alert the terrorists, she would introduce subtle malfunctions and inconsistencies that would slowly undermine their confidence in their equipment. Simultaneously, Captain Park would use his undercover skills to infiltrate the local criminal networks that were providing logistical support to the terrorists. His mission was not to gather intelligence, but to spread carefully crafted misinformation that would make the terrorists believe they were facing threats that didn't actually exist. Lieutenant Thompson would coordinate a psychological operations campaign designed to increase stress and paranoia among the terrorist leadership. Using electronic warfare techniques and carefully timed communications intercepts, she would create the impression that their security had been compromised in ways that would force them to constantly adjust their defensive preparations. The complexity of coordinating all these elements while maintaining operational security seemed overwhelming, but Marcus had developed detailed contingency plans for every phase of the operation. His experience with multivariable tactical problems had taught him how to manage complex operations where traditional command and control methods were insufficient. Colonel Mitchell reviewed the plan with her characteristic attention to detail, identifying potential weaknesses and testing Marcus's reasoning behind each element. After 2 days of intensive analysis, she made her decision. It's either the most brilliant tactical innovation I've seen in 20 years, or the most elaborate way to get an entire team killed, she said. But, given the alternatives, I'm authorizing the operation. The mission began on a cold Tuesday morning in November, with the team deploying to a staging area 15 kilometers from the target facility. For the first 72 hours, their activities would be largely invisible to the terrorists, focusing on electronic warfare and information operations that would create the conditions for the final rescue phase. Marcus coordinated the operation from a mobile command post, monitoring multiple data streams and adjusting tactics in real time as the situation developed. The psychological pressure of commanding such a complex operation was intense, but his years of training had prepared him for exactly this kind of challenge. The first signs that the plan was working came when electronic intercepts revealed increasing confusion and disagreement among the terrorist leadership. The subtle system malfunctions were making them question their equipment, while the misinformation campaign was forcing them to respond to threats that diverted resources from their primary defensive positions. By the fourth day, the facility's defensive posture had become fragmented and reactive. Instead of the coordinated defense they had originally prepared, the terrorists were now trying to respond to multiple perceived threats simultaneously. Their preparation, which had been their greatest strength, was now working against them as they struggled to adapt to a situation that didn't match their expectations. The final phase of the rescue operation lasted exactly 40 seconds, just as the mission title had predicted. Using the confusion and resource dispersion created by the preliminary phases, Marcus's team was able to penetrate the facility's defenses and reach the hostages before the terrorists could mount any effective resistance. But those 40 seconds represented the culmination of one of the most sophisticated military operations ever conducted. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of gunfire. It was the recognition by everyone present that they had witnessed something unprecedented. The terrorists who had spent months preparing to defeat any rescue attempt found themselves completely outmaneuvered by tactics they hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter. Their sophisticated defenses had been rendered useless not by superior firepower or technology, but by superior strategic thinking. The hostages were recovered without casualties, and the terrorist leadership was captured intact, providing intelligence that would prevent multiple future attacks. But, perhaps more importantly, Marcus Williams had demonstrated a new paradigm for special operations that would influence military thinking for decades to come. Colonel Mitchell's after-action report described the operation as a fundamental breakthrough in tactical methodology, noting that Marcus had elevated special operations from a tactical discipline to a strategic art form. For Marcus himself, the mission represented the completion of an extraordinary transformation. The uncertain young recruit, who had once been mocked by his peers, had become one of the most respected tactical minds in the military. But, more than that, He had discovered a unique way to serve his country that utilized all of his diverse capabilities and interests. The military had given him the opportunity to become something he never could have imagined when he first walked into that recruitment office. And, in return, he had given the military new ways of thinking about complex problems that would save countless lives in future operations. The laughter that had once followed him through basic training had been replaced by the respectful silence of professionals who recognized genuine excellence when they saw it. Marcus Williams had found his place in the world, and, in doing so, he had helped make that world a safer place for everyone.